When most people hear the word Viking, they think of fearless warriors, seafaring explorers, and rugged adventurers. But beneath the surface of Norse glory lies a darker, more brutal reality. Central to Viking society wasn't just honor, bravery, or conquest, it was slavery. Known as thralls, slaves were a fundamental part of everyday life in the Viking world, and their stories reveal a disturbing underbelly to the mythic tales of old. Slavery, among the Norse, was not just a byproduct of war, it was a system. The Vikings didn't merely capture people for revenge or punishment, they hunted them. Raids across the British Isles, Ireland, and the Slavic regions weren't random outbursts of violence. They were calculated expeditions for profit. Villages and monasteries were targeted not just for their wealth, but for their human cargo. Monks, farmers, women, and children, anyone unlucky enough to be in the wrong place, were seized, bound, and taken to Viking markets. One of the biggest centers of this human trade was Hedeby, a major trading town in what is now Germany. Here, captured people were bought, sold, and shipped across the Norse world. From Iceland to Constantinople, the reach of Viking slavery stretched wide. Arab chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan and others documented Viking traders along the Volga River who sold slaves to the Muslim world, often describing them as cold, cruel, and completely indifferent to the suffering of the people they bartered. The life of a thrall was harsh and unforgiving. They could be forced to farm, build, or serve in households, but their roles extended beyond labor. Women were especially vulnerable. Many were taken as concubines or forcibly married to their captors, their identities erased, and their fates sealed. Children born of slaves were often slaves themselves, though manumission freedom granted by a master was possible in some cases. Still, their status remained permanently marked, and even freed thralls were often second-class citizens. The Norse sagas, while often romanticized, don't shy away from mentioning slavery. In fact, they talk about thralls almost casually as an everyday fact of life. The heroic tales of Viking warriors are filled with moments where slaves are gifted, killed, or used as pawns in power games. A chieftain's wealth was often measured not only in silver or land, but in the number of people he owned. This wasn't seen as shameful. It was a symbol of status and dominance. Religious conversion in Scandinavia didn't immediately change this. Even as Christianity spread, slavery persisted. Some Christian rulers in Scandinavia even used the church's teachings to justify enslaving pagans. It wasn't until the late medieval period that slavery began to fade in the North, pushed out by both economic changes and evolving moral frameworks. But for centuries, it was not just tolerated, it was foundational. This hidden history challenges the image of the Viking as a noble barbarian. It shows us a society deeply reliant on human suffering. The Norse were master traders, expert sailors, and legendary warriors, but they were also slave raiders, human traffickers, and ruthless profiteers. This reality doesn't erase their achievements, but it paints them in a fuller, harsher light. The Viking Age wasn't just about exploration, it was about exploitation. And for the thousands of thralls whose names were never recorded, whose voices were never heard, the Viking world was a prison from which there was little escape. The Viking Age was forged in fire, the fire of burning villages, monasteries, and towns. The Norse raids that terrorized Europe from the late 8th to the 11th centuries were not isolated or spontaneous. They were often methodical, seasonal, and strategically planned campaigns of violence designed to plunder wealth and instill fear. The first widely recognized Viking raid took place in 793 CE when Norsemen attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne, an island off the northeast coast of England. To the Christian world, it was a horrifying desecration, a sacred place defiled by blood and steel. But to the Vikings, it was a target rich in treasure and unarmed people. The choice was not random. Monasteries were filled with gold, relics, and supplies, and they were often poorly defended. This pattern of choosing soft targets would become a hallmark of Viking raids. These attacks soon expanded. Ireland, Scotland, and northern France bore the brunt of early Viking brutality. River systems became highways of invasion. Norse ships, with their shallow drafts and extraordinary speed, could move far inland with little warning. Towns like Rouen, Hamburg, and Paris were raided multiple times. In 845, a Viking fleet under the legendary chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, or someone later mythologized as him, sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris, demanding a ransom to leave. What terrified the locals most wasn't just the violence, it was the unpredictability. The Vikings struck in the dead of night or in broad daylight. They appeared where no army could be mustered in time. Survivors described them as demons, ghosts, or divine punishment, because their savagery was unlike anything Europe had seen for centuries. But contrary to the myth of mindless barbarism, these raids often had a clear economic and political logic. The Norse targeted regions during times of internal instability or leadership transitions. They learned local customs, geography, and vulnerabilities. Sometimes they even returned to the same village year after year, like seasonal harvesters, only the crop was silver, slaves, and blood. Some Vikings turned their raids into longer occupations. Coastal settlements in Ireland and northern England became Viking strongholds. Cities like Dublin started as Norse encampments. Over time, these bases grew into permanent trading hubs, but they were born from violence. The tactics used during these raids were brutal. Massacres of civilians were common, not just for loot but as psychological warfare. Buildings were burned, leaders were executed or humiliated, and captives were chained together and marched back to ships. Resistance was often met with disproportionate cruelty, whole villages wiped out as a warning to others. Vikings also took part in ritual killings, including what some sources call the blood eagle, a gruesome execution method that may or may not be myth. While historians debate its authenticity, the fear it generated was very real. Norse raiders crafted their image as monsters to spread panic before they ever arrived. The reputation was a weapon, and it worked. Yet even within Norse society, there were disagreements about this way of life. Some sagas depict raiders as outlaws or morally suspect figures. As Viking societies became more settled and Christianized, internal tensions grew between those who sought stability and those who preferred chaos and plunder. But during the height of the Viking Age, raids were a key part of Norse identity. Young men earned glory and wealth by spilling blood. Kings and jarls measured their power by how many ships they could launch in spring. And for the people of medieval Europe, the sight of dragon-prowed ships on the horizon was a sign to flee, to pray, or to prepare to die. The image of the Viking as a heroic explorer overlooks this era of terror. For generations, coastal communities lived under constant threat not because they were at war, but because they were near the sea. And the sea, in those centuries, belonged to the Northmen. Viking warfare was not just about strength and courage, it was about efficiency, fear, and domination. The Norse were not bound by the chivalric ideals that would later define European knights. Their tactics were shaped by pragmatism and brutality, designed to break enemies quickly and utterly, to instill terror before a battle even began. Viking armies didn't march in rigid formation. They fought in fluid warbands, often led by powerful chieftains or kings. Each warrior brought his own weapons, typically an axe, spear, or sword, and his own armor, if he could afford it. Shields were central to their strategy. Formations like the shield wall, a dense line of interlocked shields, allowed Vikings to both defend and strike with lethal coordination. But battlefield skill was only part of the equation. The Vikings excelled in psychological warfare. Their reputation preceded them. Tales of their raids spread like wildfire, burned churches, massacred towns, enslaved women. These stories weren't always exaggerated. The Vikings wanted to be feared. In many cases, towns would surrender without a fight, offering gold or supplies simply to avoid destruction. This kind of intimidation was often more effective than the sword. When they faced resistance, the Vikings responded with overwhelming cruelty. They killed prisoners of war without hesitation. They burned villages to the ground. They targeted not only soldiers but civilians, understanding that to break a people, you must break their spirit. The idea of total war was not a modern invention, it was practiced by the Norse in the most literal sense. Even their naval tactics were brutal and efficient. Viking longships weren't just transportation, they were war machines. Fast, maneuverable, and capable of landing almost anywhere, these ships gave Viking forces the ability to strike where no one expected them, then vanish just as quickly. Their control of rivers and coastlines allowed them to isolate cities, disrupt trade, and cripple local economies. In battle, Vikings used hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and night attacks. They didn't follow rules of engagement or declare war with ceremony. To them, war was about gain and glory, not honor. They would attack during religious holidays, when defenses were down, or during harvest, when men were in the fields. Nothing was sacred. Everything was an opportunity. Some warriors went even further. The berserkers, ferocious fighters, said to enter a trance-like fury, became legendary for their inhuman rage and fearlessness. Clad in animal pelts, often howling like beasts, they would charge into enemy lines with no regard for wounds or death. Whether fueled by ritual, substances, or sheer psychological conditioning, they represented the most terrifying face of Viking violence. But ruthlessness wasn't confined to the battlefield. Political maneuvering among Viking leaders could be just as savage. Betrayal, assassination, and forced oaths were common tools of statecraft. A jarl might eliminate a rival not through negotiation, but by burning his hall while he slept, or poisoning him at a feast. Alliances were fragile, often sealed with blood and broken with fire. Conquest brought no peace. In places like England and Ireland, Norse settlers continued to wage war long after establishing control. They demanded tribute, so-called danegeld, from local rulers, promising not to attack in exchange for silver. This protection money became a cycle of extortion, pay or perish. Even within their own communities, Vikings enforced law with violence. Execution, mutilation, and outlawry were common punishments. A man declared outlaw was denied all legal protection. He could be killed on sight. Justice was swift, brutal, and often public, serving as both punishment and deterrent. The Viking way of war was not just a matter of conquest. It was a way to assert dominance, crush resistance, and reshape entire societies. Through terror, speed, and unrelenting violence, the Norse carved their legacy into the bones of Europe. And while their sagas may celebrate the heroism of great warriors, they also reflect a culture where mercy was rare and survival came at a cost. Today, the Vikings are often remembered for their ships, their exploration, and their myths. But behind the romance lies a legacy of brutality. Their tactics were not just effective, they were remorseless. And for those who faced them on the battlefield, in their villages, or in their homes, the coming of the Northmen meant one thing: no mercy.